Well, we've reached the end of the course, and there's only one thing left to do, which is to kind of wrap it up. And there are a lot of different ways to wrap up a class in Congress. I could sort of recapitulate the various things that we've learned about the electoral system and the functioning of committees and the power of party leaders and outside groups and the budget process. That's one thing. I'm not going to do that because I think that's hopefully unnecessary. If there are aspects of this course that you would want to sort of deepen your understanding of, you can always just rewatch the lecture videos from each of the modules. The other way to go about this is to kind of zoom out and look at the role of Congress in our broader political system and in our political culture, and to kind of place Congress in the overall democratic society of the United States. I'm not going to do that either, though that's very tempting. What I want to do is kind of a middle question, and the question is here on the board. How well does Congress manifest the will of the people? Right? This is tying a specific part of our overall democratic society to the bigger question of, does it do one of the things that we want a democratic society to be able to do, which is to have our foundational policy-making institution manifest the will of the people. Now, there are other big questions that we could ask that I'm also going to not ask and answer, but I just want to sort of note them, right? One of the other questions that would be like this, only I think at a bigger sort of, from a bigger, broader perspective, is how well does Congress exemplify how well does our congressional system, as it's embedded in the overall constitutional system, exemplify the principles of democracy? Democracy has a lot of principles. One of those principles is popular sovereignty, which is another way, kind of a more familiar way of saying manifesting the will of the people. So I'm going to focus this wrap-up lecture on the question, how well does Congress adhere to the principle of popular sovereignty? But the other principles of a democratic society are separation of powers, checks and balances, individual rights, political equality, rule of law. I feel like I'm forgetting something, but anyway, you get the idea, right? This is actually from another class. I'm trying to picture the board from the democratic theory class where I have the principles listed out. I could be more prepared and have them written down in front of me. But you get the idea. I'm not going to go through all of them anyway, which is why I don't have them listed out. That is a big question, and that's a worthwhile question. How does our congressional system exemplify the various principles of a democratic society, well or poorly? And I will just sort of, hint at the fact that if we went through the list of principles of a democratic society, our congressional system would do better on some than on others. And that is how it has to be. If you've taken the democratic theory class, or you've thought about the nature of democracy and principles of democracy, it doesn't take too much thinking and paying attention to how a democratic system works to know that some of these principles are actually in conflict with each other, right? Popular sovereignty, manifesting the will of the people, and checks and balances, which make sure that the power of the government is limited with an internal system of powers and responsibilities. Those two things often get in each other's way. Popular sovereignty and individual rights also could get in each other's way. To the extent that we protect individuals' rights to do what they want, we limit the power of the people to make rules for everybody. So some of these principles come into conflict, so any system is going to do better at some than at others. So it's a worthwhile question, and I didn't make it the final paper or topic or discussion for this course, but I very could have easily said, write a paper that examines how well our congressional system exemplifies the foundational principles of democracy, so that we can see what kind of democratic system we have as it's manifested in Congress. Now, the reason I don't want to do that is because, one, that's a huge question. And that could really take up an entire course. Two, that connects also a very big question of what is a democracy? How do you establish a democratic system? That's the subject of an entire course. Some of you in this class have probably taken that course, democratic theory. If you haven't, and these kinds of questions that I'm raising right now interest you, definitely take democratic theory in the future. It's being offered in the summer of 2021 as well as in the winter of 2022, and into the future. The reason I want to focus on this question is because it takes one of those democratic principles that seems to be the most connected to what Congress is. Congress, as the legislative branch, is supposed to be the direct conduit of the voice of the people. That's what the legislative branch does. The judicial branch represents essentially the legal world, not the voice of the people, but legal thinking, which is really the rule of law is the core principle of the judicial branch. Also, individual rights, checks and balances, all of the principles kind of touch all three of the branches, but the core principle of the judicial branch is the rule of law. The core principle of the legislative branch is popular sovereignty. So we want to know, how well does Congress represent the will of the people? That's also a really tough question because of this. What is the will of the people, right? This is a very abstract concept. Ever since it was introduced in Enlightenment political philosophy, it's raised more questions than it's answered. How do you find the will of the people? What is it? Does it really exist? Is it an abstraction? Is it an eminent property of a society coming together? Is it just the mathematical sum of the different viewpoints? Is it the result of the struggle of different factions and interest groups in a society? What is the will of the people? So also giant questions, which get addressed, though not answered, in the democratic theory class. But if we say the will of the people is what serves the people, now that doesn't necessarily answer it a whole lot better, right? That's not a whole heck of a lot less abstract. But what serves the people? And I'm gonna adopt then for this lecture that kind of definition. What serves the people? What addresses the concerns that the American people have? What addresses the issues that are core to the way people actually live their lives? What gets at what matters to the American people? To the extent that we would have let's say, a responsive, proactive, effective system of legislating, that would seem to, whatever the actual outcomes, whatever the policies, whatever the specific things that, whatever kinds of budgets and laws and regulations and government structures that Congress established, if we thought that it was responsive and effective and proactive, then it would seem like it's manifesting the will of the people, whatever that is, pretty well. So we can kind of adopt some broad, let's just say, sort of meta criteria for evaluating how well Congress manifests the will of the people by saying, is it responsive, proactive, and effective? Given those three criteria and what we've learned and explored about the functioning of Congress throughout this term, I think that it's relatively safe to say that our congressional system, as it was constructed and as it's evolved within the context of our party system, our broader political culture, the technological and economic history of the United States, that Congress doesn't get good marks for responsiveness, proactiveness, or effectiveness. Let's take these three one at a time and go through them briefly, right? How responsive to what is out there in the world, in the United States anyway, among the constituents are, one, members of Congress, and two, Congress as a whole as an institution. And that right there, that distinction between individual members of Congress and Congress as an institution already shows how problematic it is to have an effective legislative system. This is definitely something that I think has been heavily implied, is that as individual members of Congress do what they do to, one, win, and two, keep winning, and three, to sort of do the job as they see that they're supposed to be doing the job, they're not necessarily key to be responsive to all of their constituents, or most of their constituents. And the institution as a whole, because it's not really, Congress is not a thing, it's not a person, it's not an entity, it's a collection of activities, individuals, processes. It ends up, there are things that do or don't get done by Congress, but Congress, I air quote that, is not a thing. It's an institution, it's a collection of various kinds of things. It's a collection of people, it's a collection of committees, it's a collection of traditions, it's a collection of processes, it's a collection of precedents that sometimes aren't codified into official processes. All of these things go together to produce what Congress does. But let's just think about individual members of Congress first. How responsive are individual members of Congress to their constituents? And forget about the broader American people, right? Because one of the things that I think that, let's just take the fact that we have a district/state-based system of representation. All 535 members of Congress represent a territorially distinct set of people. So while that might not be the best way to manifest the will of the people, we're just going to take that as our given, because it is our given. Do individual members of Congress respond well? Are they well connected to, and are they keyed to the values, interests, ideas, concerns, problems of their constituents? And the answer, of course, varies for individual members, but in general, the answer is not that much. And the reason why not that much is kind of part of democracy itself, but then also part of our particular version of democracy, our district-based winner-take-all two-party system, which is that if you're an elected official at any level, but I'm just going to talk about Congress, if you're representing 800,000 people in a congressional district, a House district, or you're representing, say, 2 million people, or 8 million people, or 600,000 people in a state, whatever your constituency is, while you are all of those people's representatives, who do you pay attention to? Who matters to you? Whose concerns, whose problems, who are you going to listen to? Who are you going to try to serve best? Who are you going to invite into your decision-making process? Who are you going to worry about, basically? In any electoral system, you're never going to worry about everybody, right? Because you're not going to win everybody's votes. And in no electoral system do you need to win everybody's votes. You need to win, in our system, the most votes in your district. And if it were 2 candidates, that would be 50% plus 1 vote. If it's multiple candidates, it could be as low as 35%. I mean, it could be really low if there are 7 or 10 candidates. But let's just say there are 3 candidates. You can actually get by with 35%. Now, so you don't need everybody, but also you don't even need all to pay attention to and worry about all of the people who vote for you. Because many of those people, given our system, are going to vote for you no matter what. I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. There are people who are going to vote for me no matter what, just because of my D or my R. So I don't actually have to worry about those people. The people I have to worry about are the decisive votes. Those votes that will determine whether I win or lose, right? And the term we have for this set of voters are swing voters. Sometimes they're called moderate independents, so they don't always have to be moderate, right? They tend to be, because of our political culture, they tend to be centrist and non-party affiliated. But there are plenty of people who are registered as Democrats who sometimes vote Republican, sometimes vote Democrat, who are maybe actually not moderate. They could be fiscally conservative and socially liberal. And that doesn't necessarily make you moderate. That actually makes you sort of bipolar, politically bipolar, which is common, right? There are an awful lot of people who are fiscally conservative. They want low government spending, low taxation, who are socially liberal, who want reproductive rights, who want gay rights, who want equality. So those two things aren't so odd. But the people who are the ones who might or might not vote for a given candidate are the decisive voters. And so they're the ones who are going to be the most worrisome to either members of Congress who are already elected or hopefuls who want to get elected. You have to pay attention to the decisive voters, right? Who's going to get you over the tipping point of getting enough votes to win the election? Now, if we're going to use that as our criteria for responsiveness and say, well, members of Congress are clearly not only going to be responsive to the decisive voters, then this question is definitely not going to get a very good, strong answer for our system of Congress. Or how well? Not well, because members of Congress aren't paying attention to all of their constituents. Now, just because you have to get those decisive voters in order to win, in order to be in Congress, to make those decisions, doesn't mean that the only thing you are going to think about are those people. There's a way to win those votes and pay attention to and worry about those people at the same time that you also then more broadly care about your entire district, about all of your constituents, or at least about most of them. So that even though you are going to take some very clear action to win over and keep the allegiance of that small group of decisive voters, the ones that will put you over the critical mass, you might, because of your temperament, your personality, the broader culture, pay a lot of attention to people who are not necessarily either your voters or not even your key voters, right? And that is like, that concern, that, let's call it conscientiousness on the part of a representative, really can't be legislated. It really can't be structured. You can't create an electoral system that's going to make people care, elected officials care about voters that aren't the decisive voters. That's a personal choice, it's a cultural norm, it's a broader sort of expectation in that particular kind of democratic society. And I think that this is one of the ways in which the United States falls pretty short. We don't necessarily, as a people, as a culture, as a democratic society, have the expectation that our politicians will be broadly responsive to all of their constituents. Now, we want them to, but we don't actually expect them to, and we accept that they don't, right? We don't say, well, you know, that person who's in Congress represents my ideas and values really well, but they do a terrible job of representing the values and ideas of other people, so I don't think I'm going to vote for that person. We don't do that, right? And even just putting it that way, it sounds kind of asinine that you would think that way. But that's why it's a broader societal and cultural question. Like, if our society expected us as voters to expect that of our elected officials, then that would ripple in to the way that elected officials actually think about their job and function in their job. But we don't have that kind of political culture. We don't have that set of expectations. Even though we might wish it was that way, we don't actually in reality functionally expect that of our elected officials. So is it surprising that they're not responsive? No. And the problem too is then the people who might want to be more broadly responsive to the bulk of their constituents, not necessarily 100% of their constituents, because there are people who are on fringes and you just can't pay attention to everybody, but the bulk of their constituents, even the people who vote against them, and even the people who definitely are going to vote for them and are just like, you can take them for granted, there are people who want to do that, but it's actually challenging for that kind of political personality to win a congressional election in the sort of party system, political culture, and technological environment that we occupy today. Now, I could go into that really, really deeply and just spend an hour, 2 hours on the question of why it is that people with that kind of political conscience aren't likely to win elections, aren't likely even to get primary victories, party nominations. That question gets explored pretty well in the media, voting, and opinion class, or opinion, media, and voting class. I always forget which order the three is. That's being offered this summer of 21, fall of 21 as well. So if those questions are of interest to you, you can see how like Congress touches all, the way Congress functions touches all kinds of different subjects. And I happen to teach all of these classes. But one of the reasons why individual members of Congress are not more broadly responsive is because we don't have this broader societal expectation. And when there are people who would be like that, the nature of our electoral system and our political culture and the technological context in which people run for office in the 21st century makes it very difficult or nearly impossible for those kinds of people to win. Now, what about Congress as an entire institution? How responsive is it to the American people, right? Because the 535 members of Congress represent the entire nation. One of the reasons why that question is relatively easy to answer is that there is no national electorate, and Congress itself is, while it's a body of the national government, of the federal government, the people who go to Congress are delegates of particular constituencies. Nobody is there representing the American people. They're there representing the people of Oregon, or the people of Oregon District 2, or the people of Idaho, or the people of Alabama District 3. They're there representing that, and there's nothing in the functioning of Congress or in our broader political culture that would get those people representing those different constituencies to come together in a body and set aside their connection to their constituency back home and begin thinking only about the broader American people. We don't have a very collectivist-oriented culture. We don't have a sense of a national community that would incentivize that kind of shift, right? So there's two stages in any democratic system, the electoral system and the system of governance. the electoral system is district-based, and so if we are running in a district or a state, then when we win and go into the governing system, there could be a shift of thinking. You could be like, okay, I got elected into the Alabama 3rd District, and those are my constituents, and those are the people who are going to either re-elect me or they're going to elect a challenger next time. But when I'm in the halls of Congress, they matter less to me than the broader American people, the broader national community. Now, politicians will speak about the national community. They'll pay lip service to this concept, but we have a very individualist and very localist culture, so that it would be very surprising if very many members of Congress got elected, went to Congress, and then shifted their perspective on what it is that they're doing. And of course, as an institution, a group of people, as opposed to say one person who can make unified decisions, the members of Congress have to work together to get anything done. And when you do that, it's unlikely that you're going to somehow collectively aim towards the overall national good. So our electoral system and our political culture, again, make it unlikely that Congress as an institution is going to be very responsive to the national community. The individual members aren't even necessarily very responsive to their entire constituency, so it would be extra surprising if then Congress as a whole were responsive to the broader national community. What about proactive? Proactive means getting out ahead of problems, solving things before they get to the crisis level, addressing issues before they're so bad that actually there might not even be a very good solution. Getting out ahead of things. Congress, I hope that you could answer this and you're thinking to yourself, yeah, I hope he doesn't spend a whole lot of time on this particular feature of the lecture because, it's like, yeah, it's clear from everything you've said and that everything I've experienced, Congress is not very proactive. And yes, now I will say that I think this stems from a lot of things, one of which is so deep down that I don't even think we can be too condemnatory of Congress itself, and that's human nature. Humans are not particularly proactive in general. We have the capacity to be proactive. This is one of the things I think that's kind of one of the paradoxes of human nature, is that we are able to see the future. We are able to project ourselves into a present that doesn't yet exist, able to see the consequences of what's going on now and how that might play out in the future, and we can say, well, we don't like that, so we can take action now. We have the capacity to be proactive. But the incentives that evolutionary psychology has sort of hardwired into us mitigate against actually being proactive. So one of the paradoxes is that we can be, but we tend not to be proactive as beings, right? Think about yourself. How often do you actually see a problem coming and deal with it before it gets bad? And how often do you let it get bad, right? And I'm not saying that you do this all the time. People can be and are proactive, right? But it's not a general tendency. And it's definitely harder when you go from the individual level to any kind of group, right? A committee, a representative body. Any larger group of people is going to have an even harder time being proactive. Congress itself is even more challenging because of the nature of the electoral system and our political culture at being proactive. There tends to have to be, to get elected officials to really take action, to overcome all the obstacles that are built into getting something done. It takes things to be either almost at a crisis level or at the crisis level or possibly even beyond the crisis level, right? In some cases, it takes a catastrophic terrorist attack of the order of 9/11 to get the federal government to organize its national security apparatus in a way that's efficient and effective and geared towards 21st century threats, asymmetrical threats like terrorism. It takes a 9/11 to do that. And when things get bad, our system is relatively responsive. So while not being proactive, our system is decently reactive. Once a crisis is reached, our system does a decent job at fixing it. Now, not always, right? And I don't want to multiply all the examples of when our system is reactive successfully and still not. So no, not responsive, not proactive. What about effective? Does the action that Congress takes address the things that the American people needed to address. And this is actually where, and you may be surprised after what I've said about these first two, this is where I think actually Congress as a whole, historically, deserves pretty decent marks. And the reason I say that is because the accumulation of statutes, regulations passed by executive branches that have been created by Congress, I think, while of course there's always flaws, there's always screw-ups, there's always holes in the coverage that our federal government gives to the landscape of issues and problems that face the American people, collectively, in the aggregate over history, congressional action does a decent job. What do we have in the United States? We have a prosperous, peaceful, stable nation that is influential around the world and that is largely satisfactory to the people who live here. Now, I don't want to paper over all of the ways in which that's not true. I don't want to paper over systemic racism, deep material inequalities, unfairnesses, inequalities in opportunity, anything that we can point to. Those all exist as well. In other words, America is not a perfect society, right? And that's no society is a perfect society. But I would say that actually, for such a large, diverse nation, in such a large, interconnected, confusing, diverse, conflict-ridden world, that the United States is a pretty good place. And a lot of the ways in which it's a pretty good place are a result of government action, right? Why is our food supply relatively safe? Because of laws that stem back to the early 20th century, the Food and Drug Acts, the Meatpacking Acts. I forget the names of all of them because I really am terrible with legislative names. But all the way back, we have really at this point actually the quality of water and air in the United States is really pretty good. Certainly on a global scale, compared to our own air and water in the 70s and into the 80s, much better. We're safe from foreign invasion. Our political system, despite an insurrection on January 6th, is stable. There is laws are routinely enforced. Most people feel safe and secure. Now, I hate that one. Like, everyone should feel safe and secure, not most people. Everyone should feel like they're being treated fairly and that they have real opportunity, not most people. But to the extent to which the will of the people is to broadly, and I always said as broadly as possible, okay? But that's too much. I'll get to that in just a second. But broadly, providing the benefits of stability, security, certainty, material success, cultural power around the world. All of these things are provided to a great extent by the action that's being taken by the federal government. Much of which is being done because of congressional action, either to create a certain law, a certain policy program, or an executive branch department or agency that does and implements some kind of thing, right? I mean, for one thing, and this is the thing that I always marvel at because I think that it's unmarveled at by too many people. The United States provides a free education for every child in the country. Now, some families don't take advantage of that. They go to private school, and we give that opportunity and that freedom to do so. But that's a massive undertaking. And of course, there are problems with our educational system, and there are inequalities, and we fall short, and math scores aren't as good as they are globally. But what a tremendous thing to take on as a society and to do year in and year out. Every child gets educated. Where we fall short, of course, wouldn't it be great if I could also say everybody has access to affordable or free healthcare? Like, that would be really great. And we're trying to move in that direction. And while, of course, Congress is not being proactive or responsive, many people want the federal government to do more in the healthcare arena, and Congress is not particularly responsive to that, I would say, pretty widespread desire among people who, whatever their party and ideology happens to be, want better healthcare outcomes for the United States. So definitely don't want to say, like, we're doing great. I would say we're doing well. And that's why I would give decent marks to Congress in effectiveness. Not great marks, right? Like responsiveness, I'm going to call this a D-. Proactiveness, C-. And effectiveness, B-, somewhere in there, right? Like, I mean, these are kind of arbitrary grades, but I think that they map onto what I've been saying so far anyway. Most of the ways in which Congress is effective in the sense that I'm talking about it are historical, not present. Our current Congress doesn't seem to be very effective. And I would say actually that's because our current Congress, like many Congresses, doesn't seem to be particularly proactive or responsive. And so I think we mistake then those for being ineffective, right? Congress is ineffective in the present moment, but in the historical aggregate. And I think that this is how we need to evaluate Congress, because it's a status quo-oriented institution, as I've said many, many times. One of the things that's beneficial about a status quo-oriented system, and this is part of the reason why it was designed this way, is that once you have an achievement, that achievement is very difficult to lose and to undo, right? I think it's really easy to forget that we have an effective Social Security system. Like, there's a lot of hand-wringing about the Social Security Trust Fund running out and benefits falling short of being able to provide people with a decent standard of living after they've retired. But for nearly a century now, the United States has provided this social safety net effectively for the American people. And without it, things would be a lot worse. There would be a lot more food insecurity. There would be a lot lower healthcare outcomes, particularly among the elderly. There would be more people who are disabled, who are basically just systemically impoverished because of their disabilities. So the Social Security safety net created by the 1935 Social Security Act, politicians have come and gone who wanted to undo it, who wanted to unwind it, who wanted to completely get rid of it, privatize it, change the benefits, all of those things. The status quo orientation of Congress makes that virtually impossible. And in a way, what that does is that contributes to the effectiveness of our congressional system. The Congress in 1935, well before I think anybody in this watching this video was born, though maybe there were some people who were watching who were born then, but way back, almost 100 years ago, 85 years ago, Congress did an amazing thing, and it continues to be effective. And so I think that goes in the category of, yes, Congress is effective. So manifesting the will of the people. If the people wanted back then and continue to want some level of material security and certainty for the future, for their old age, as well as some kind of equality of baseline caring for the disabled and the elderly, then so the Social Security Act and the amendments that have been passed along the decades to update that are pretty effective. Same thing is true, like, guaranteed student loans are more expensive and harder to get than ever. Certainly, but when they were first created in the 1960s, but they're still there. Federal student aid, federal financial aid, federal grants to K through 12 system, K through 12 school systems to make sure that kids can get free breakfasts and free lunches and can get adequate technology and textbooks and material support. That's all a result of congressional action from the 1960s that is still in place. So when we look at effectiveness, I think that we have to look at the entire system. And we can say, of course, there should be better support for K through 12 schools. There should be less food insecurity than there is. There should be probably a stronger social safety net. We could have a system of government action and regulation that would provide for less material inequality, less of a gap between the rich and the poor. We should have policies that will reduce the impact of systemic racism in policing and in education and in economic attainment. Yeah, all of those things true, for sure. And if Congress were more proactive, we would be getting those things more. But the fact is that a lot of problems that Americans have are being decently solved by the existing system of government. And so I think that we get to put that as Congress is relatively effective. Now, I could go on and on, multiply examples. I think it's unnecessary. I think that you get the point. Like almost any institution, Congress gets mixed marks on a kind of a big evaluative question. This is a great question to ask. we shouldn't not ask it just because it's very difficult for Congress to get an A on this particular question. It's a really good question to ask, and it always is worth asking because what could we do to get those scores up, right? How do we get from a D- on responsiveness to a C, to hopefully someday to a B, right? And even aspirationally towards an A, like, very aspirationally. The reason why asking this question is worthwhile is because it points us in the direction of, okay, what could be done to narrow the gap between what would be good and what is actual right in this particular moment. Now, I want to wrap up this class by leaving it here with a kind of a relatively positive note about our congressional system, because so much of what this course has done is looked at the ways in which Congress is dysfunctional, problematic, inefficient, not proactive, unresponsive. Let's finish here by noting that Congress is not as much, overall, historically in aggregate, as much of a shambles as we might think it is. And that is not to say, of course, that there aren't really big things that still need to be done to bring these scores up. And in a certain way, there's a ceiling on it, right? How responsive can an institution that is made up of 535 different people, each of whom represents a distinct constituency around the country, embedded in a broader political culture that's not collectivist, that doesn't incentivize, or I shouldn't say incentivize, doesn't spur us to think in terms of the broader national community. There's a certain ceiling of how responsive that institution is going to be. And so expecting utter responsiveness is unrealistic, right? It's like, I'm a father. I try to be a perfect father, but I don't actually try to be a perfect father because that's an unrealizable ideal. I try to screw up as little as possible. I try to, within the foibles of human nature and my individualism and the nature of the family structure that I'm raising my kids in, I try not to screw up as much as I possibly can. And so I kind of bring that same kind of evaluation to the way that I look at political institutions. And because this class is, that Congress is the political institution that we're focusing on, that's the kind of perspective I bring to this evaluation question. Okay, as I said at the beginning, there are lots of other questions that we could ask about our congressional system that are beyond the scope of this lecture, beyond the scope of this class, but I wanted you to note them. So if you are fascinated by these questions, there are other places to go to continue asking them. For now, our time to ask and answer questions within the confines of Poli Sci 413 Congress have come to an end, and so I'll just say thanks for the attention you've given to all of the material that I put in front of you for this class.